Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prana nata pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Kotha Mohamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhuttanvan Premarasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Vairaga Yug Nija Bhakti Rasam Prayatnair Apayayan Mam Anubhipsu Mandam Kripam Buddhirya Paraduka Duki Sanatanastam Prabhumashrayami Adadanastrinam Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Same Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Bhaktirya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu. Today we're going to begin a new brief series on a text entitled the Sri Rupa Sanatana Stotram. So this is a composition of about 50 verses, 49, so it's not a grand text, meaning not one of great length, so I don't think it'll take so long to go through it, but we'll give some attention to the verses in this with light detail. In other words, we're not going to attempt some elaborate discussion, but what is relevant and highlighting important themes in the text we will avail ourselves of. In a few days, on Monday by most calendar counts, will be the disappearance day of Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. So in honor of this time where remembrance of Rupa Goswami is typically done, we'll spend a few sessions reading this stotra, which speaks in praise of Rupa Sanatan as well as offers prayers to them. So I won't go into elaborate introduction or a summary of the content because we can just jump right into it and we'll cover it within a relatively short period of time. So I've just written a very, very simple introduction about the author, Sri Govardhana Bhatta, because he's not all that well known within the Sampradaya. So that's at the top of the fresh file that was just shared. Let me just, sorry, one sec. Okay, so Sri Govardhana Bhatta is a fourth generation descendant of Sri Gadadhar Bhatta, a celebrated poet and disciple of Sri Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, who came to Vrindavan at Sri Jiva Goswami's exhortation after Sri Jivapad heard one of Sri Govardhana Bhatta's poems. So there's a history that is told in this regard, that Govardhana Bhatta, Gadadhar Bhatta, sometimes there's two persons here, so it can be slightly confusing. There's Govardhana Bhatta, who's written this Rupa Sanatana Stotram, and then there's his ancestor, Gadadhar Bhatta. So Gadadhar Bhatta was, I believe, from the Telangana district, but some district outside of Braj, but had come to hear about, Radha Krishna and the Bhagavatam and entered into the spirit of Braja Bhakti, and was naturally talented and gifted as a poet, and started to write poetry about Krishna and about Braja Ras and so forth. And his poems were appreciated by sadhus and others traveling through his area. So it so happened that persons who heard some of his poetry had memorized it and would sing it from time to time as they traveled or walked about. And so the story goes that some sadhus who had appreciated some of his poetry and were singing his poetry made their way to Braj. And one day, one such sadhu was singing one such poem, and there is some record of the exact poem. I didn't pull it up here, but you can find the exact poem that was quoted. And as the sadhu was walking past an area where Sri Jiva Goswami was seated, then Jiva Goswami heard this poem being sung, and he was filled with mixed emotions. In other words, he found the poem to be excellent in terms of its language and composition and so forth, but it was an expression of Madhura Rati for Krishna without reference to Radharani, or it was something that spoke about Madhura Rasa but didn't feature the Leela of Radha with Krishna. So Jiva Goswami thought, oh, this is unfortunate. Some, person of high caliber is absorbing themselves in meditation upon, Krishna's Madhura Rasa Leela, but not availing themselves of the immense fortune of meditating upon Radharani and her Leela with Krishna. So he sent a verse of Raghunath Das Goswami to be shown to that poet. In other words, this person who came by, he said, when you go back, you convey this verse to that person. So this was a verse in the Stavavali of Raghunath Das Goswami, the first verse of what's called the Swasankalpa Prakash Stotra. So I'll share that verse that Jiva Goswami quoted. It says, Anaradya Radha Param Bhojarenum Anashrita Vrindatavim Tat Param Kam Asambhashitad Bhava Gabhira Chitan Kuta Shamasindo Rasasya Vagaha. So it says, without worshipping the pollen of the lotus of Sri Radha, without taking shelter of Vrindavan, which bears her footprints, and without conversing with those whose hearts are deeply immersed in her bhav, how can one swim in the rasa of the ocean Sham? So in other words, if you want to really relish Shamasundar, or the ocean of rasa that is Shamasundar, then you need to do so as a follower of Sri Radhika, as someone who is attuned to her bhav and her prema for Krishna. And to do that, you need to come to Braj and you need to associate with those whose hearts are steeped in that adherence to Radharani, in that service to her. So this is a rhetorical question, which is giving an indirection, that if you want to really appreciate Krishna, then come to Braj and associate with the followers of Radharani. So Jiva Goswami sends this verse, and it is said that Gadadhar Bhatta received this and responded and came to Braj and took up residence in Braj and associated with Jiva Goswami and others, and eventually became a disciple of Raghunath Bhatta Goswami. And as he lived in Braj, it said that he uncovered deities of Radha and Krishna, who became known as Radha Madan Mohan. Not the same Radha Madan Mohan of Sanatana Gosvami Pad, but another Radha Madan Mohan. And technically the Radha of Madan Mohan also came after Sanatana Goswami's time, but this was a second Radha Madan Mohan, which it is said that Gadadhar Bhatta found within the sand on the bank of the Yamuna, that he unearthed these deities, that they were understood to have revealed themselves to him. And so he lived his life in service to these deities and wrote numerous poems and so forth. So he would be then a first generation, so to speak, follower of the Braj Goswamis who lived in Braj. And he was a grihasta. He had a son, or more than one son. I don't know exactly how many. There's a chart, but I can't recall off the top of my head. I looked at it last week. But from him has come a familial lineage which has come down and which still exists today. There's a highly erudite and highly appreciated scholar today in Braj named Achyutalal Bhatta, which I'm sure whom you're all familiar with, who's a very frequent lecturer at so many venues around Vrindavan, and is also publishing excellent editions of commentaries on the Bhagavatam and various other works of some of his ancestors, and is, speaks with some of the cheer and charm of Braj Leela in a very endearing and also very erudite manner. I've had the privilege of hearing some of his classes and also having some personal conversations with him. So he is a highly honorable representative of this lineage today. And in the meantime, or rather between then and now, the fourth generation in this lineage comes the author of our poem, the Govardhana Bhatta. So I have here that Sri Govardhana Bhatta's ancestral lineage is as follows. So the son of Gadadhar Bhatta was Rasi Gotangsa. His son was Sri Krishna Bhatta. His son was Sri Lal Bhatta. And his son was Govardhana Bhatta. Sri Govardhana Bhatta was a contemporary in Brajamandal of Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad, whom he praises in one of his Sanskrit works, the Vaishnava Vandana. So there's an interesting composition called the Vaishnava Vandana, also by Govardhana Bhatta, where he praises many of his contemporaries in Braj at the time. So we can infer from that he lived in the late 17th century or perhaps into the early 18th century, and had great admiration for Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad. He praises Chakravarti Pad first among so many other prominent figures of his era. And Sri Govardhana Bhatta also praises his father, Sri Lala Bhatta, as being his Shiksha Guru in verse 5 of this Rupa Sanatana Stotram, and in verses 4 to 7 of another of his compositions called the Radha Kundastava. It is further understood from a Sanskrit commentary on another work of Govardhana Bhatta, his most elaborate work known as the Madhukeli Vali, that Sri Govardhana Bhatta is initiated in the disciplic line of his ancestor Gadadhar Bhatta, as would be expected. In other words, we would expect that his Diksha line would also come in his ancestral line. but the exact name of his guru is not known from his writings. As Sri Govardhana Bhatta offers homage to his guru in verse 3, it should be of his Radhakun Stava, but does not mention his guru's name. So perhaps persons who are disciples of Achyutalal Bhatta or others in the Raghunath Bhatta Parivar may know the exact name of Govardhana Bhatta's Diksha Guru. I haven't ever sought to research it, but he's by familial generation fourth from Gadadhar Bhatta, and his Diksha perhaps came from his grandfather or some other member of Gadadhar Bhatta's lineage. I don't know. Anyway, that's just a little framework and background to appreciate our author. So he's written 5 or 6 Sanskrit compositions of, nothing super long, but compositions of 10, 50, 100, couple hundred verses like that. So this particular poem, the Rupa Sanatana Stotram, is 49 verses long. So now we will make our attempt to relish that, or to appreciate what he has to say in praise of Rupa Sanatana and how this can inform our Shraddha and our Nishtha in Rupa Goswami and his those who have followed his line of thought. So with that, I will begin. So, verse 1. Ratnam kechidavapya santu mudita muktendra niladikam brahmananda para brahmananda para bhavantviha kechit parashonmukha Shrivaya sakichitta samputagatam Gauranugodghatitam Radha Kanchana Rekikam Rakatam Chinmo Vayam Gokule. So he says, here in this world, some may become delighted by obtaining a jewel, such as a pearl or sapphire. Others may become absorbed in the bliss of Brahman. Some others may become intent upon the supreme Isha. We, on the contrary, seek the emerald inlaid with the golden streak of Radha in Gokula, who was held in the casket of the heart of the blessed son of Vyas, and has been revealed by followers of Gaura. So, I've written just a little on this. The author begins his hymn by speaking in praise of his Ishta Devatas, Sri Sri Radha Krishna in Gokula. He alludes to people intent upon worldly pursuits with his mention of, quote, those delighted by obtaining a jewel, that is, any highly desirable material object. He alludes to followers of the path of jnana, with his mention of persons being, quote, absorbed in the bliss of Brahman. He alludes to bhakti to Bhagavan Narayan, and more broadly to bhakti to all forms of Bhagavan, within which Aishvarya is prominent, with his mention of persons, quote, intent upon the supreme Isha. He speaks of Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Gokula as, quote, the emerald inlaid with the golden streak of Radha, to playfully suggest a partial similarity between persons intent upon worldly objects, that is, quote, a jewel such as a pearl or sapphire, and bhaktas of Sri Krishna, that is, those who are devoted to Sri Bhagavan in his form within which Madhurya is predominant. So this is how I'm seeing it anyway. And I should have mentioned already, I have yet to ever see any Sanskrit tika on this verse, or on any of these verses, on this composition. So I should have also mentioned, as I did the introduction, I have 2 sources for this composition. The first was a publication by Krishna Das of Kusum Sarovara, who all Gaudiya Vaishnava scholars are well acquainted with. He was a disciple of Ramdas Babaji Maharaj, who had a printing press in Kusum Sarovara in the middle of the 20th century and published many, many editions of works that are relishable or considered valuable to followers of the Gaudiya Vaishnava community. And many of them he included Hindi translations. So they're Devanagari Lipi publications, some of which contain translations into Hindi. And then the second source I have is a Bengali edition, which itself says is based off of the Krishnadas of Kusum Sarovara edition, and has a Bengali translation which almost entirely follows the Hindi translation, but has a few mild modifications to it. And as far as the readings of the Sanskrit verses themselves, they're more or less identical. There's very little differentiation between the two. So those are the two sources I'm working with. I am not aware of any Sanskrit commentary on this text. If there is one, I would be delighted to see it, but I don't know of one. So the comments I'm offering here are just sort of common sense or contextual with reference to earlier Gaudiya Vaishnava works. So Govardhana Bhatta is situated in the Braj Milu of the late 17th century. So he's a contemporary of Vishwanath Chakravarti. He's, seeing the works of the Goswamis as the kind of primary orthodox set of viewpoints upon things, and he's relishing the contributions of Rupa Sanatana and the implications, if you will, of Rupa Goswami's theology and practice. He's championing that, if you will, in this text. And in some places he speaks with much personal zeal. In a few cases, with all due respect, it's almost a bit over the top. But full points for enthusiasm and for great relish of the contributions of Sri Rupa Gosvami and Sanatana Gosvami. And so as we'll see, what goes on in this text is that there's a kind of a solidification of what it means to be a follower of Rupa Gosvami and what are some of his wonderful contributions. And oftentimes when you get into this discussion of who theologically contributed what, it can become debatable because great Vaishnavas of other sampradayas have also commented on scriptures, have also shed light in their poetry, and exactly how much interplay or interaction existed between some of those persons who were contemporaries in Braj can be difficult to say with all certainty. And sadly, there can sometimes be vested interests where people want to champion so-and-so as the, quote, original author or contributor of such and such revelation or such and such theological development or such and such unique bhav or what have you. And personally, over time, I've become less inclined to trying to sort of champion that so-and-so is supposed to get all the credit for X and someone else is not supposed to get credit for it or these kind of things, but rather to see that, that there is a gradual interplay between, how distant or how intimate it may be varied, but we all benefit from the contributions of others and the clarity that's brought by the contemplation, by the composition of others. In other words, there's a power to awareness, and when awareness is focused, especially the awareness of high caliber Vaishnavas and the current of grace that flows through the hearts of Vaishnavas that are greatly pure and of deep appetite for these subject matters, that there's inevitably, naturally, a surfacing or an emergence of refinement and of richness and of relishability. And so even the idea that, you know, one person composes their own books, you know, or composes their own poetry, even that in one sense is problematic. Like, everyone is inheriting the cultural wealth that they've been born into, right? Rishi Reen is something mentioned in the Bhagavatam. We all have an indebtedness to the seers of the past who've established the language, the culture, the technology, the texts, all these things that have made all such contemplation possible. So really everything is a codependent co-creation, you know. But undoubtedly there can be, you know, a primary vessel whose heart and whose, you know, depth of what can you say, human capability and, you know, aesthetic sensibility can be seen as the primary agent of that revelation. And so to champion that and to honor that is wonderful and beautiful, but we don't want to do that in a way where we end up deprecating that in another at the same time, or, you know, that there becomes a sense of competition or a sense of animosity or between such persons. That would be unfortunate and to miss the point of the whole thing. So as we go through, we'll see how, you know, many of the contributions of Rupa Goswami and Sanatana Gosvami are highlighted and championed, and we'll relish that, we'll value that, but not in a way that makes us ending up becoming fanatical and lacking respect for other Vaishnava Sampradayas or other great poets or other persons, but with in a sense of a collectivity and an appreciation for the spirit of all of those things. So anyway, that's a couple of relevant points I should have mentioned earlier. Coming back to where I was before, there's this, he refers to the pursuit of, you could say, conventional worldly pleasures or worldly objects as attaining a jewel. And then he speaks of Krishna as an emerald that's inlaid with the gold of Radha. So, you know, the implication, you know, can be, you know, as that famous verse in the 33rd chapter of the 10th canto goes, that Krishna appeared like this Marakata or emerald, and then the commentators say he's actually a blue sapphire, but surrounded by the gold of the gopis. He appeared more greenish because blue plus gold becomes green, and thus he's called an emerald. So you could apply that line of thought in this case as well, that he's spoken of as a Marakata or an emerald because of he appears as such when he's, you know, when Radharani and her golden countenance is beside him. Or the word Marakat sometimes can be interpreted as an alternate word for sapphire itself. So, you know, I didn't bother to write out all these kind of technicalities here, but in that way, the word emerald can have multiple ranges of meaning. But to say that worldly people are happy with a jewel, but we like the jewel Krishna, you know, then there's a token acknowledgement that there's some similarity to the relishing of the Aprakrita Leela, the Madhurya Leela, the more human-like, you know, Lokanugapi, Sanyonyam, what is it? Lokanugapi, Sanyonyam, Priyata Tita Lokika, this verse in the 5th chapter of the 2nd Kanda of the Bhagavatamrita that we hear so often from our Guru Maharaj, that it's as if following the ways of the world, but yet enriched with a type of love that's completely beyond this world and is a wonderful blend of extraordinary Aishvarya and Madhurya together. This is the Braj Krishna. So to here juxtapose that appreciation for Krishna, which has, you know, the lokikatva of, you know, which is compared to here like appreciation for a jewel, but also the Aishvarya of Narayan, which is spoken of earlier, that some may devote themselves to forms of Bhagavan in whom Aishvarya is predominant, but we're interested in the jewel Krishna. So to say that there's a human-like element, there's an Aishvarya element, there's also a Madhurya element, all of this is, and that there's, you know, that the Krishna with Radha is unique in compared to the Krishna in general. All of these elements of Rupa Goswami's theology are all implied by this choice of metaphor. And then he goes on by saying that, quote, by describing Sri Krishna as an emerald, quote, inlaid with the golden streak of Radha, he implies that Sri Krishna's beauty, although it is ever fresh and superlative, even in comparison to all of Sri Bhagavan's other forms, is enhanced by Sri Radha's presence at his side. As a precious jewel is kept carefully in a casket, so the author describes this gold inlaid emerald as being held in the heart of Sri Shukadev Goswami, with the implication being that Sri Shukapad did not divulge the beauty of this gold inlaid jewel in full in Srimad Bhagavatam, but rather presented only veiled expression of it. So, as it's been widely discussed, the name of Radharani specifically is not in the Bhagavatam, nor are the names of some of her companions or the other gopis. So there's descriptions or statements which are thought to be statements of Sri Radhika herself, various statements in the Venu Gita, in the Brahmar Gita, in other parts of the Rasa Lila, are all thought by Sanatana Gosvami and Jiva Gosvami and other commentators to be statements of Radharani, but her name specifically is not mentioned. So in that way, there's a certain veiling or a certain, lack of complete description, if you will. So he's thus speaking of this gold inlaid jewel as being held in the heart of Shukadev, meaning he didn't fully bring it out and show everyone the jewel. He held it in his heart and spoke while keeping it in a little bit. And in one case, Sanatana Goswami explains in the Bhagavatamrita that he didn't mention the names of Radharani and the gopis directly, because if he did, it would have been too overwhelming. His feelings of separation from them would have been so much more intensely agitated by directly referring to them that to keep the dialogue going, he had to refrain from going into too much detail. So this jewel was held in the heart of Shukadev, this suggestion being that it was veiled, its presence was made known, but it wasn't fully shown. And then thus he adds this point, Gauranuga Udghatitam, that it was revealed by followers of Gaura. In other words, by here, principally by followers, he means Rupa Sanatana, that they've come along and shown that this jewel in the heart of Shukadev, as he was speaking the Bhagavatam, they've come and brought out that jewel and shown its light and shown its facets and shown its beauty. So that's a theme that's developed over the course of this whole composition, is how Rupa Sanatana have brought out the glory of Radharani and the gopis, how they've championed service to Radharani and her intimate companions as the ultimate form of upasana, and how they've in that way brought out a fine essence of the Bhagavatam, which is highly appreciable and not easily graspable from the text itself. So these are all themes that the author further develops as the composition goes on. So this opening verse kind of sets the tone, if you will. And also by this acknowledgement of a diversity of viewpoints, he also develops that aspect later in the text by talking about how the ideals of Rupa Goswami or the grace of Rupa Goswami can succeed in compelling people to leave aside other paths or other ideals and take up the path that he's put forward in his poems and in his theological envisioning. So obviously by virtue of its merits, so he wants to show some of the wonderful contributions that Rupa Goswami has made that are thus make the path that he's laid out compelling and perceived to be of ultimate value. So that's kind of an overview of most of the themes that will come in the stotra. So I'll come to the next verse, and just as far as meter, almost all the verses in here are in Shardula Vikridita, but there are a few occasional exceptions. So this one is in Sragdhara, but you won't see too many like this. So he says, Radha bhavabhipurnam brajarasa dhayanod bhuttagurnam suturnam nrityantam bhaktamadye nirupama madure kirtane krishna nam varshantam prema sindhum parama karunaya plavayantam trilokim bande chaitanya devam parijana sahitam charuchami karabham. He who is completely filled with Radha's bhav, whirling about as a result of drinking the rasa of Braja, very briskly dancing amid bhaktas, and the incomparable sweetness of kirtan of Krishna's names, showering down an ocean of prem, and out of paramount compassion, flooding the three worlds with that prem. I offer obeisance to he of charming golden luster, attended by his companions, Chaitanya Dev. I'm going to read it one more time. Radha bhava bipurnam braja rasadhayanod bhuttagurnam suturnam nrityantam bhakta madhye nirupama madure kirtane krishna nam varshantam prema sindhum parama karunaya plavayantam trilokim bande chaitanya devam parijana sahitam charuchami karabham. He who is completely filled with Radha's bhav, whirling about as a result of drinking the rasa of Braja, very briskly dancing amid bhaktas in the incomparable sweetness of kirtan of Krishna's names, showering down an ocean of prem, and out of paramount compassion flooding the three worlds with that prem. I offer obeisance to he of charming golden luster, attended by his companions, Chaitanya Dev. After speaking in praise of Sri Sri Radha Krishna in the previous verse, the author next speaks in praise of Sriman Mahaprabhu, and does so specifically with the angle of vision that Sriman Mahaprabhu is Krishna himself, absorbed in the bhav of Sri Radha. Because of his absorption in Radha's bhav, Krishna relishes Brajarasa in a superlative manner. And as a result of this, he becomes moved to dance enthusiastically while chanting his own names in the company of his bhaktas. As he thus relishes Brajarasa by means of Radha's bhav, and expresses the richness of that experience through his dancing and chanting, it is as though a vast ocean of prema showers down upon everyone in his midst. The unparalleled richness of this experience also gives rise to a feeling of paramount compassion in Sri Krishna's heart for all who have yet to ever experience something so profound. And thus he feels compelled to flood, that should be the whole of the world with that prem, so that all may be blessed with the chance to relish it. So I'm reading here a suggestion of causation. In other words, as we know, it's only by virtue of the sthai bhav that there is the experience of rasa. So the fact that he's described here as first being filled with Radha's bhav, and then drinking the rasa of Braja, and then whirling about, it's like you have the sthai bhav, the experience of rasa, and then the anubhav then comes the whirling, the dancing, the chanting, and so forth. And the effect of that, those anubhavas being perceived, and the way that those further stoke the richness of the tasting of the rasa, creates the effect such that it's like there's an ocean of prem, or a vast amount of prem that's perceivable in his vicinity. And then I take the idea that he's showering it down, but then it says, but he's also flooding the worlds, and then he's adding a cause of parama karunaya. Then I think his implication is saying that he relished this, amongst those who were in his personal company, and he also flooded the world, the implication being like, and he also made efforts and arrangements such that this would be experienced by other people at other times and places as well. In other words, such that anyone and everyone could have the chance of being showered in such prem, or ultimately experiencing such prem and the rasa that prem enables one to taste. So what greater compassion is there than to give someone the greatest of all gifts, or the thing that is of greatest ultimate experience? So the first verse speaking about Radha Krishna, now coming to Mahaprabhu, or this idea of Radha and Krishna in a special combined manifestation. So this description can be taken as the reason underlying the statement made in the previous verse, that the, quote, emerald inlaid with the golden streak of Radha in Gokula, who was hidden in the casket of Sri Shukapada's heart, was revealed by Gaura's followers. So, why did Gaura's followers reveal what was in Shukadev Goswami's heart? Why didn't they just think, oh, he wanted to keep it slightly veiled, so let it remain veiled? Well, because Mahaprabhu wanted to flood the world with that prem that Shukadev had, and with that prem, that object of prem that Shukadev adored in his heart. And well, why did Mahaprabhu want to do that? Parama karunaya, because he was, immensely compassionate, because he wanted that, compassion, or karuna is defined as intolerance of the suffering of another. So there's something that happens, so to speak, when someone has profoundly meaningful and satisfying experiences, then even the conventional contentment of another can seem like suffering. In other words, sometimes, in ordinary life, if people love a certain type of food, let's say, and then they meet someone from another culture and, you've never had this food? Oh, you've never lived. You've never even eaten. You've never tasted anything. The person eats every day, but the fact that they haven't had this taste is felt to be such a loss that even what that person might be content with is thought to be just like a type of suffering. And so out of compassion, one is intolerant of that perceived suffering, which is more actually just the absence of having had this profoundly satisfying experience. And so one feels, you must also have this chance. You must also get the chance to taste this. So seeing something like that, Mahaprabhu wants that everyone will have this. So he therefore graced Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Gosvami, to bring this out, to make the arrangement, to write the poetry, etc., that would enable persons to have this experience. So this description here, that he's absorbed in the bhav, he's relishing the prem, and then he's, out of compassion, he's thinking, let's flood the world with this. Then this can be seen in the context of the composition to explain, why did Gaura's followers reveal it? Because this is why. Because Gaura got overwhelmed in the midst of relishing it himself. This description can also be understood to convey the author's intent to emphasize that he sees Sriman Mahaprabhu to be Krishna himself, absorbed in Sri Radha's bhav. So if we watch how the author speaks about Mahaprabhu throughout this composition, we can see that he follows the style of the Goswamis closely, where he uses the name Chaitanya or Chaitanya Dev often, which was a name that the Goswamis themselves used, and especially Sanatana Gosvami used intentionally with the idea that it could, so to speak, exploit a ambiguity of being a name of Krishna and a name of Mahaprabhu at the same time. And that they wanted that ambiguity. They wanted that sense that this is really one person who's just performing these two leelas, as opposed to trying to emphasize that Mahaprabhu is another form of Bhagavan who needs another set of everything, so to speak, but that really Mahaprabhu is Krishna, and this is also a way of his relishing Braja Rasa. It's, in one sense, part of Braja Leela that he performs such pastimes. So, as we'll see in the next verse, and throughout the composition, the style of how Mahaprabhu is spoken of is less, you could say, in the style of some of the Bengal writers, where the names like Nimai, Vishwambar, Gaura are more prominent, and rather the names, Chaitanya Dev and speaking of Mahaprabhu as being, the next verse starts with this phrase, Sri Chaitanya Hari. So, like the name Gaura Hari or Gaura Krishna, that it's Golden Krishna. So it's speaking about Mahaprabhu, but the name is such that it emphasizes, this is Hari himself, this is Krishna himself, this is Golden Krishna, this is Golden Hari, this is Chaitanya Hari, or in the Charitamrita sometimes, Kaviraj Goswami, instead of speaking of Mahaprabhu as Sri Krishna Chaitanya, he speaks of Mahaprabhu as Sri Chaitanya Krishna, meaning that this is Krishna in this appearance of Chaitanya. So in that sense, I see his choice of words, Sri Chaitanya Hari, as following that style, like Rupa Goswami in the opening second verse of his Vidagdha Madhava, which is cited in the Mangala Charan of the Charitamrita, Hari Purita Sundara Duti Kadamba Sandipita Sada Hridaya Spuritu Va Shachinandana, that he speaks of Shachinandan, or the son of Shachi, as Hari. So, that Shachinandan Hari, or Chaitanya Hari, this was the style of the Goswami's vision and also poetry related to Mahaprabhu. So we can see that the style here of Govardhana Bhatta carries that Goswami-esque influence in terms of how Mahaprabhu is depicted. So, well, then, I don't know, we can come to the next verse, but this one has a little bit more context and discussion, so maybe I'll just leave it for next time. So, I think I'll just stop a few minutes early, and in case anyone has any questions, comments, corrections, other thoughts on this new subject matter we'll dive into for some days, the Rupa Sanatana Stotram of Govardhana Bhatta. So, yes, Vidyaji.
Pranam, thank you so much. This is really nice introduction and discovery, actually. Never heard of this great Vaishnava poet. When you were talking about different collaborative influences to Siddhanta from different angles of Sampradaya groups or Pandits, is that what comes to mind is that I was always wondering what was the state of Vrindavan before Mahaprabhu actually came for the first time? Was there any type of bhajan going on? Was there any type of, other, saints roaming around, relishing? Or was it just simply folk culture of Krishna by Brajabasis carry on with the stories, repeated in tradition? And was it part of it, like, village culture? Was the Krishna memory of Krishna was a part of village culture, or was there any actually bhajan going on at that time before Mahaprabhu came?
Oh, that's a very interesting subject matter. I'm not so qualified to speak about it. I can say a few things, but that's something, frankly, that I would be interested to learn more about. And there's so much wonderful Gaudiya Vaishnava literature. I feel like I'm in a shower of all these wonderful works of the Goswamis. It's like, where do I have the time to look at the great works of other Vaishnavas as well? I would love to do that as well, but it's kind of just like, there's so much good stuff. There's not even enough time in this life to relish it all. So in one sense, I feel I haven't made so much of an effort at that, just because I'm, the classical Sanskrit, honey in the corner is the way, when you've got like a pot of honey in your own, in the corner of your own house, in other words, like in your own cupboard, you don't go off in the hills like picking honey out of the bees' hives, like you've already got your honey. So I feel a little bit like that, but I don't mean in any way to say that there isn't great value or things. So I can say a few things about that. First of all, that there was definitely a pre-existent folkloric tradition, that was prominent in Braj, and there were temples, and we hear actually historically that in the 1470s, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, but a few decades before Mahaprabhu or Madhavendra Puri or persons like that came, all of the most prominent Krishna temples in the Mathura district were sacked by, colonists at that time. So there was definitely a Brahminical tradition, and something that, not that villagers are not doing bhajan just because they're maybe not doing it according to Puranic or Agama texts in a technical sense. Some type of bhajan they're doing, but in terms of a Sanskritic culture, it was definitely there in the times before Mahaprabhu or some of his immediate predecessors arrived there. But it was also facing heavy opposition in the political climate of the time. But one thing we can observe clearly in the Hari Bhakti Vilas is numerous citations from the Krama Dipika. So the Krama Dipika was a manual for, you could say, essentially Vaishnava Sattvic Tantra and Krishna-specific worship. And Sanatana Gosvami drew many elements out of that manual in his composition of Hari Bhakti Vilas. He also drew from some other pre-existent manuals, but he drew from the Krama Dipika. I can't say off the top of my head, but I would guess more frequently than any of the other ones. And the Krama Dipika was composed not long before that. It was composed only, I believe, in the 1470s or the 1460s by one of the Mahants of the Nimbarka Sampradaya, named Keshav Kashmiri Bhattacharya. And he had lived for some periods in Braj, but had also spent time in Kashmir, hence he got the title Kashmiri. But what he represents is a very significant presence of the Nimbarka Sampradaya in the Braj region preceding the arrival of, quote unquote, the Gaudiyas. And I've read there's a nice thesis on this subject by a scholar of the Nimbarka Sampradaya from a university in Scotland, and according to some of his research, I think his name is Vijay Raman something. I'm sorry, I don't recall his name off the top of my head, but he documents that Nimbarka likely lived in the 7th century prior to Shankaracharya. and that he developed a Vedanta, which he based on a school of thought which was a type of Beda or Swabhavika Beda, and recognized Radha Krishna specifically as Parabrahman. So sometimes there's a narrative presented that the classical understanding was that Vishnu, Narayan, was the supreme, and then Ram, Krishna, Nrsimha, these are all avatars of Vishnu. And that later the Gaudiyas came along and inverted this and put Krishna on top and demoted Vishnu. Sometimes people have some sort of analysis like this. But from this other perspective, that viewpoint came into the state of acquiring a status of orthodoxy through the work of Ramanuja Acharya and Madhvacharya. But prior to Ramanuja and Madhva was Nimbarka, who actually put Radhakrishna as Parabrahman and not Bhagavan Vishnu. And he, in a Nimbarka theology, Lakshmi and Radha are not the same person. They're two different Devis. And in his view, Radha is the supreme Devi. So the Nimbarka Sampradaya has a lineage of leaders that were the successor to the central leadership role that Nimbarka had. And this Keshav Kashmiri, who Sanatana Gosvami drew from greatly, was the head of the Nimbarka Sampradaya in the late part of the 15th century, and spent certain periods of time in Braj, wrote the Kramadipika as well as other works. And his successor, who became the next leader of the Sampradaya, was named Sri Bhatta. And he composed from a text called the Yugala Shataka, where he wrote in vernacular, what's now you would call Braj Bhasha, or a language similar to that. And he wrote about, you could say, esoteric, confidential Radha Krishna upasana performed in the bhav of a Sakhi of Radharani. And this is something that is spoken of in the works of Nimbarkacharya himself. Nimbarkacharya, when he, through his Vedantic analysis, brings Radha Krishna to being Parabrahman, he also speaks of them existing in Vrindavan and being served by Sakhis in isolation from all other parikaras. So, from what I understand, and I'm no expert on this, and if there are some Nimbarki scholars out there, please correct me. I'm not trying to misrepresent anything. I'm just trying to give a loose sketch, if you will. In somewhat of a departure from the style of Keshav Kashmiri, which was more conservative, this Sri Bhatta, the next leader, he wrote this vernacular poetry which went into much rich, esoteric detail about the intimate activities of Radha Krishna, their, things like this, as well as the role of the Sakhis in serving them. And following that, his disciple, who became the next, and he was based in Braj, then his disciple, or who continued that stream of thought and led the Nimbarka Sampradaya, was Hari Vyasadevacharya. And he wrote a text which became known as the Mahavani, and is still one of the most popular texts related to Radha Krishna Upasana in the Braj region. And he wrote in even much broader, he wrote much more prolifically and added much to, or kind of flourished or brought out in, a further degree of detail and, discussion what his Guru Sri Bhatta had, so to speak, developed or started in a literary sense. So this Sri Bhatta and Hari Vyasadevacharya were direct contemporaries of the Goswamis in Braj at the time. And they wrote styles of bhajan padhatis which used this methodology that they called ashtayam, which is more commonly used in our Gaudiya language as the ashtakaliya. Yam is also a word for a prahara, or one of the, dividing 24 hours of a day into 8 periods. The name for that division is sometimes called a prahara, sometimes called a yam. So this is something I haven't researched in depth, but perhaps their literature was the first literature to develop this ashtayam, or this 8 divisions of the day style of meditational upasana. Because, as we've discussed in the past, in the Dashloki Bhashya on the Govinda Lilamrita, it's explained that some bhaktas approached Rupa Goswami with the request that he write an Ashtakaliya style description of Radha Krishna Leela, and that Rupa Goswami declined, saying that the upasana that he had presented in the Stavamala was representative of what he wanted to convey. And that then, after consultation and consideration, he agreed that such a literature using the Ashtakaliya or Ashtayam format could also be written, but he said that at that stage in his life it wouldn't be for him to write, so he delegated the task to Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, who then wrote the Govinda Lilamrita, and writes at the end of the Govinda Lilamrita that he wrote it at the direction of Rupa Goswami. So, flash sign, speculation, my thought on that is that why did people approach Rupa Goswami with this request? Where did this idea that it would be nice if Rupa Goswami wrote something following this Ashtakaliya literature, where did they get this idea? It doesn't say anything about where or why in the Dashloki Bhashya, but my thought, and I'm not arguing this, I'm not claiming this, I'm just saying maybe, because of that pre-existent literature of the Nimbarka Sampradaya, where the Ashtayam is the central style of upasana, that might have, had an influence, or that might have been a source of inspiration or a source of consideration for persons in Rupa Goswami's circles, who then wanted to use some of that methodology, but wanted to keep some of the theology of Rupa Goswami in it, because the Yugal Shataka and those texts written by the Nimbarka sadhus are specifically following the style of what's known as Svakiyavad, or the worship of Radha Krishna with the idea that they're married. And actually the work of Sri Lal Bhatta is basically the idea that Radha and Krishna are eternally at the Yog Pit, and that I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but if anyone is familiar with the modern movie Groundhog Day, where this guy wakes up and lives the same day again and again and again and again and again, that something like that, the idea is that the day of Seva in the Yog Pit is Radha and Krishna's wedding day. And every night they have Rasa Leela celebrating their wedding that night. And that every day that Leela repeats again and again and again, like the ultimate joy of Radha and Krishna's Ras Leela, celebrating their wedding night. And this is, from what I understand, the basis of that viewpoint of this Radha and Krishna eternally in the Nikunja in this Svakiya context. So, we know that the Goswami, Rupa Goswami, some of the Gaudiyas have also written literature from the Parakiya perspective. And we also know from Radhakrishna Das Goswami's Sadhana Deepika that there was objection to that Parakiya style in the Gaudiya literature by others in Braj, which some objection may well have come from the Nimbarka Sampradaya. And we know that Jiva Gosvami in the Krishna Sandarbha, in the Sankalpa Kalpadruma, and some of his other works, also writes to, let's say, loosely accommodate the Swakiya perspective as well. So perhaps, that work of Jiva Goswami to integrate Swakiya and Parakiya together, as well as Kaviraj Goswami's composition of the Govinda Lilamrita at Rupa Goswami's direction, due to this request that there be some Ashtayam style literature, both of those things may have, at least in part, come about due to influence from the Nimbarka Sampradaya. And we also know that, Jiva Goswami's theology, styled Achintya Beda Beda, and the Goswami's viewpoint of exalting Radha and Krishna as the central, supreme entity, these are all, the Beda Beda orientation to Vedanta, the supremacy of Radha Krishna. These are also, have earlier present, almost a millennia earlier, in the works of the Nimbarka Sampradaya. So that, and if Sanatana Goswami is quoting Keshav Kashmiri as an authority in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, if his works are so valuable that they're evidence in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, and then the successors of Keshav Kashmiri are there in Braj as their own contemporaries, and obviously in Braj it was a much smaller community at that time than it is now. Braj, the community of Braj is like exponentially becoming populated just in the last 20 years or 50 years. Think about how, relatively few people were there 500 years ago. That Rupa and Sanatan can quote Kramadipika as an authority, that they might have some communication or that they might have some respect for the immediate successors of that person who they regard as an authority and quote in their books, doesn't seem like a stretch to me, that they would, have potentially communicated, that they would, take seriously considerations that they would have, etc. So that's one example. And then Rupa Goswami also speaks of Vallabhacharya in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu when he speaks about Vidimarg and Ragamarg and gives a loose reference to the path of sadhana that Vallabhacharya taught, what he calls the Maryada Marg and the Pushti Marg. So that Rupa Goswami was well acquainted with the praxis that Vallabhacharya was developing is indicated by the fact that he's referring to the terminology that's developed by Vallabhacharya as one of his contemporaries. Rupa Goswami and Vallabhacharya met personally in, it's described in the Charitamrita in near Prayag when Mahaprabhu came there, and that they might have had further collaboration in Braj wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination. So like that, and then, there's the Hit Harivangsha and the Radhavallabha Sampradaya, and there are some, different historical narratives about that, and traditionally there has been some debate about the exact nature of Hit Harivangsha's relationship with Prabodhananda Saraswati and Gopal Bhatta Goswami and others, and I'm not going to try to weigh in on that. That has a complex set of sources to it. But the fact that they knew each other, the fact that they, were part of the same milieu is obvious. And then you also have Haridas, Swami Haridas, and what's now the Banki Bihari centric tradition. And I can't say as much about that, but I'll just, I don't want to go on too long here, but just to say that all of these elements, these great poets who are all revered in their traditions as the Siddha Mahatmas of the highest caliber, that they were all coexisting in Braj, that they were all writing and all meditating and all praying, all there in the same space at the same time, that there must have been some significant level of mutual collaboration or communication or even, peer review or what have you. It seems almost impossible that it wouldn't be the case. but to historically reconstruct exactly what originated where or why, I'm sure some scholars could have a great attempt and, exercise intense levels of, intellectual reasoning to try to demonstrate, the trajectory of ideas that might have moved through those communities at those times. And I'll just say that I don't feel the need to try to break it down into dividing up the credit. These people came up with this, and these people took this, or these people developed this off of them, or I don't feel that that's really the spirit of how to appreciate these things. If all of this is the grace of Radha Krishna, if any insight into their lila, any insight into their prem is only made known by their grace, to start measuring who got more grace or whose grace is real grace or not real grace, I don't feel like that attracts greater grace to us, right? But if we just aspire to also be objects of such grace, then all of these persons who were so blessed with that grace in one shape or form, we want the grace of them all. We want the foot dust of them all, and we want, to honor and to cherish all that grace that flowed through them, and whatever poetry and adoration of Radha Krishna that it inspired. So to me, it seems very in the spirit of the humility of the Goswamis as they've written, to not get into, disjunctive, analysis and, claims over crediting and so forth, but to foster a broad collectivity and a broad sense of gratitude, a broad sense of respect, and a broad sense of fundamentally shared ideal, with a clear and respectful understanding that there are different exact theological viewpoints, there are different exact, interpretations of certain aspects of Vedanta, there are different styles to the upasana, there are different subtleties in the bhav that's aspired for, and that's all okay. Let all of those differences exist and see them as all ways by which this higher thing is coming down and accommodating and satisfying the hearts of so many people who have different backgrounds and different sensibilities and different needs. And if we can see the beauty in all of that, respect all of that, and honor everyone who's involved in that, then I feel we've gotten the overall spirit of the thing, and we ourselves can be candidates to be blessed with entrance into the richness of what all of this is for. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some thoughts on that topic.
Oh yeah, it's very elaborative and to the point. And this is a long discussion to be held, but no time now, so I would not ask more. But maybe if you have time, I'll just continue privately.
Yeah, sure, happily.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really nice insight. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, happily. I think at one point, Radhapadaji, did I see your hand up?
You did, and I didn't want to take more time from the group, but just kind of something that I've kind of noted, or maybe you can confirm. So it looks like this Parivar from Raghunath Bhatta Goswami it looks like it's kind of similar in the sense the Gaudiyas were actually, Bengali, right? The Bengali Vaishnavas that have, who have also, made Braj their home in the course of the generations. But I mean, do I have that correct?
Unfortunately, I think I didn't hear everything that you said. You were talking about the Govardhana Bhatta parampara. I think the line, my connection dropped out a little bit there. And then you were talking about Gaudiyas coming from Bengal, but I missed something in the middle.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So what I wanted to say was, in my kind of thinking, this lineage of Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, from where this text comes through a Diksha lineage through, I think that's his name. It's something similar, that this is a Braj based Gaudiya Vaishnava Parivar, something similar to the Radharman Goswamis, who are also Braj based for many generations. Little different of the actual Bengali Gaudiyas that, from Bengal, who have come and resided in Braj, and has probably maintained a lot of the the Bengali, the Bengali centric, in terms of songs and kirtans and, writing in Bengali and, like this. So I'm kind of guessing that this is what I'm understanding.
Yeah, I believe so. I think that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was just a little comment. So.
Okay, sure. All right, great. Well, I think we can conclude here for today, unless anyone else has anything else. And if we're so blessed, then in our next session, we'll dive further into these praises of Rupa Sanatana from Govardhana Bhatta Goswami. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radha, Jai Shri Radha, Pranam.